Tilda Cvrkel, and I am a philosopher. My first doctorate is in philosophy, my second being clinical psych. So I start from the theory land. I do ethics. My career has been as an ethicist for most of my time until I started doing empirical research on interventions. So the stuff we're talking about today is near and dear to my heart. It's the stuff I worry about as both an ethicist and a researcher myself. So let's get going. I promised you one talk would follow into the next, so I deliver. Let's talk about why we're here, finding your why, what's going on with your reasons behind thinking about mHealth research in general. So forgive me while I do a tiny bit of theory. You can't take the philosopher out of the girl, whatever discipline you put her in. And so let's talk about what it is we think about we're doing when we're doing science. So in my field, there's a big fight between value-laden and value-neutral science. Are we doing science because we're trying to promote some good or some end or some goal, or are we trying to merely discover things about the world? Philosophers argue that's what we do, and most come down on the side that it's probably the case that value-neutral science doesn't exist. All of us in doing science have some value we're promoting, whether that's knowledge or additional information about the world, that's still of value. And thinking about how we frame our decisions and our inquiries actually has a lot to do with the values that we use. So let's talk about the values that we import when we do mHealth research, the stuff that comes from being in the health realm. So a lot of times when people...
One second, we're still seeing the first slide. Are we supposed to be seeing other slides? Because it's not moving forward.
Still on the first slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, sorry.
No problem. Again, old school philosopher, I would do this with chalk if I could. So there'll be more talking than words. Everyone's like, oh, you need the toga, I know. So still on the first slide. So let's talk about the kinds of promotions and values and commitments that come with health research. And this is just being built in to the kinds of things that we do when we do mHealth. Part of what happens when we talk ethics is usually people talk about how not to do bad, right? People think about ethics in the terms of restrictions. What are the things you should never do, the lines you shouldn't cross? I actually think that's a really impoverished view. When we think about the work that we do through the lens of ethics and thinking about using the ethics framework to really approach all of our decision-making, the truth is the reason that most of us are in this research realm is because we already have certain kind of ethical commitments. The idea of the promotion of health is a good, right? And thinking about what it is that we're doing always through who we're benefit and who we're potentially harming is going to help us make much clearer sense of how to make decisions around our own research. So let's talk about the potential when we talk about ethics, thinking about why we're here, what good is there to be gained in mHealth from an ethics perspective. Well, so you know some of these very, very well, right? So part of the potential, we have increased benefit for patient monitoring and care. So continuous monitoring leads to better data gathering. One of the things that we struggle with any collection of health data is actually connecting to our clients, to our patients. So the potential for using mHealth is going to allow for more integrated, more seamless, and ultimately better relationships between the people who are researching and providing interventions and the clients that we serve. This also is going to allow clients to save time and have clinicians be able to serve more clients and patients. You're going to notice a theme as we work through these. So another ethical sort of value underneath healthcare, being in the health realm, is that we're here in part to affect behavioral change, right? So mHealth interventions let us connect with users in a naturalistic environment. In psych research, in one of the areas that I work in, we're constantly worried about the difference between what's true in the lab and what's true in the world. I think this is something that mHealth has the potential to do amazing good at, helping reach people where they are. It also helps us get better insight into the antecedent and consequent of behaviors, which allows us to focus on interventions for change. And then, of course, we've talked about just-in-time adaptive interventions, which allow us to hyper-focus, hyper-personalize, hyper-customize, not just from person to person, but from moment to moment within a person's experience. But the advantages are interestingly larger. So one of the advantages of mHealth, when we talk about what the potential for the technology and the distinctive form of research that many of us are doing is it allows for patients to be much more active in their own treatment or their own decision-making. It allows for self-tracking. And there's a way that what we're doing actually allows subjects, individuals, patients, clients to think about their relationship to their own choices in different ways. I like to talk about research is always an intervention, regardless of whether we mean it to be an intervention. Thinking about what that means for the subjects that we work with is going to allow us to think about what are the sort of interventions that I can introduce by means of my research. How am I changing a person's life and experience with themselves? By giving them tools to track their own information and or get into the habit of noticing enough to track. So some of these things are amazing when it comes to potential for doing ethically good things. And to continue, again, seamless transition from our earlier talk, thinking about who we study. One of the large research gaps when it comes to generalizable research, thinking about the limitations in many of the kind of large-scale research projects that we can undertake, is that we do them in areas that look an awful lot like ourselves. We do them in areas and countries that are primarily Western, educated, weird countries, right? Industrialized, rich and democratic. We do our research in areas that are convenient for us, sometimes because that's how it's always been done, but sometimes because the logistics of doing global research, of thinking about populations that are underserved, not just in our community, but on a much larger scale, the logistical difficulties are non-trivial. Thinking about what it looks like to do that kind of research in a way that is more true to people who are underserved globally. Well, what you're looking at right now is Pew Research Center, right? Slides on mobile technology, internet, and social media use throughout different kinds of economies throughout the world. We see the penetration of mobile technology being used throughout the globe. That's an opportunity to reach people, to study people who have historically been ignored when it comes to research. That's better for populations we study, and it's better for science. It's better for us to understand what parts of our assumptions generalize and what parts don't. And ultimately, we can talk about the potential for better data. So, as we all know, working primarily with self-report introduces a host of vulnerabilities to our data. There's inaccuracy. People are notoriously poor reporters. People have a hard time remembering. If you ask people to do a diary of what they've eaten in the past 24 hours, what you will get frequently does not reflect the accuracy of what they've eaten in the past 24 hours. What you get is a vague memory of maybe I had this, it's hard to say, I was busy, I was distracted. Thinking about using technology to increase the quality of the data that we gather has enormous potential to sort of cut out the middleman and faulty memory. But it also has a few other potential benefits. When we think about behavioral reporting and we think about self-report, part of the challenge is that many of us work in areas that are really, really vulnerable to stigma and shame. Thinking about the incentives that our subjects have not to report those are reasonable incentives. There are high costs for disclosing things that are stigmatized or have legal vulnerabilities. And for many of us who work in research in those areas, thinking about how to access information that is true, that is maximally helpful, when incentive structures strongly incentivize intentional deception, is something that we worry about. Cutting out self-report directly and using technology to capture decisions, locations, whatever variables I'm tracking in real time that are not merely self-report actually allows the kind of data gathering that can be maximally helpful for people to not be either quite so painful or quite so vulnerable making, at least in the sense that someone has to choose to disclose. So remember I talked about how all research is an intervention for better or worse. Self-report frequently is interventions around asking people to reflect on and consider and disclose in a particular moment that may or may not feel good to them. Having a technology that helps ease that may be a benefit to our subjects. It may not, and we'll talk about that too. So when we talk about ethics, we have certain commitments. Part of what we're doing in healthcare ethics is we are looking to promote good health, less distress, more flourishing. Let's keep those in mind as we think about the challenges that are unique to mHealth and thinking about where we find ourselves with the ethical quandaries. It's useful though to remember we already have some powerful ethical commitments on our side, and we're going to talk about how to integrate what that looks like. So one of the interesting things about mHealth and introducing different kinds of technology into what used to be a relatively simple research framework is that we've actually now changed who the stakeholders are by introducing a number of tools. So let's talk about who's involved when we think about doing mHealth research. A lot of what we do in ethics is track who are the stakeholders, who are the parties involved, and what are the individual obligations to each particular stakeholder. So here we go. So first, for stakeholders, we have clinicians and biomedical researchers. We have the people who are conducting and designing the research themselves. And so part of what the job of clinicians and the biomedical researchers look like is to think about what is the framework. How am I going to choose my questions? How do I think about why I'm choosing to ask about this variable versus another? There's an enormous amount of power in this position and an enormous amount of potential for fraught decision-making. Part of what I want to do is for people in this room who find themselves in this particular role, the back half of this talk is really going to be about how do we see our jobs as people who are designing and conducting the research from the top level down. How do we think about what it is we're asking, how we frame what we're asking, and what assumptions are underneath what we're asking in order to get the best possible results. Now, here's the thing, for those of us who work in this area, who have academic careers, who think about all of the exciting milestones of an academic career or a research career, we have our own interests beyond just the noble promotion of science. Part of what is incentivized in academia is how new and novel is your research? How good is your next funding opportunity? And so part of what that means is that people in the role of clinician or researcher have a dual role. We have a role where we're off to promote whatever goal it is that got us into mHealth in the first place. There's a reason that you are interested in healthcare research and not, say, why ducks quack at whatever frequency they quack. Both are facts about the world, but you were drawn to think about health promotion and health research in a way that maybe you weren't interested in duck quacking. Neither is inherently more or less interesting. People are passionate about all kinds of fields. But thinking about what it is about healthcare that drew your interest, that's part of your commitment, that's part of what incentivizes you to do this research. But the incentive structure is also more broad, thinking about why did you choose to research in this area given this moment in your career, given this moment in your funding, given this moment of what you see the narrative arc of what your research story will look like. The interesting thing about this for us who do this kind of research is that now we're in a position where there's a possibility for a conflict between our roles. Thinking about what it might be to serve populations to look at various kinds of health promotion, and what might be the thing that's best or most interesting or most prestigious for funding bodies or for our academic narratives. Now, conflict's not bad, right? When there's conflict between different incentives, it's never the case that automatically you have an ethical problem and we're out. In fact, promoting an academic career, promoting a research career is its own moral good. Taking care of career narratives is something that is nothing about that is shameful. But thinking about when there are two incentives that might structure us to make different decisions, part of what an ethics framework should do is help us think about how to balance between those different incentives and how to think about what it is we do when there might be conflict. So let's talk about other areas of potential conflict. So we do that by returning to the stakeholders. So additional stakeholders, when we think about mobile technology research, there are, of course, the engineers and designers of the technology. They're the people who actually make research dreams come true. For people who start on the pure science side and may not have as much of the technology background, or people who start on the technology side and make theoretical research design into reality. The actual builders of the technology are themselves stakeholders as well. We also have an enormous opportunity in thinking about partnerships with commercial entities. Much of the research that we do in mobile health is, of course, synergistic with mobile technologies of phones that we ourselves don't produce. Sometimes people use sensors that have been developed in-house or sensors that have been developed for other purposes. But when we talk about using, say, mobile technology, working with people's cell phones, working with apps that integrate with their existing hardware, whether we know it or not, we are always partnering with corporate entities as long as our research requires technology of corporate bodies in order to function. I'm sure in thinking about this, you've already seen the potential conflict that can come up when we think about the stakeholders of corporate entities and the stakeholders that we hold, thinking about what is in the best interest of our subjects and also what is in the best interest of our research. Additional stakeholders include government bodies and thinking about how much of our research is available, either through legal compulsion, should we be subpoenaed, should someone ask for our data, or things that are voluntarily chosen. So thinking about what kinds of data we gather that the government may be interested in. So a lot of my research works with people who are applying for asylum, refugees, and thinking about what it looks like when some of the people I work with are undocumented or have legally vulnerable statuses. If I collect research on this population, there is a way that things I know about them put them at legal risk and may be of interest to the government. What obligations do I have thinking about what that means? Should government bodies ask what the status of my clients are? If you do research on behavioral change, you will find yourself butting up against government interests frequently. Part of what this might look like is if you do research on, say, things like sex work, if you do research on, say, things like illegal drug use. That said, the potential for government to have an interest in our study, our research, our data is more broad. We collect a lot of mundane data that could also be really useful. We collect information on locations. So we've now had our first criminal case that incorporated evidence from trackers, fitness trackers in this case, to establish where the subject, in this case, the defendant, was located during the time of a crime. When you think about the kinds of data that you access and that you track, there's an enormous amount of material that may present vulnerabilities. We also have public interests as part of our stakeholders. Part of what public interest looks like is that the results that we come up with may have meaningful impact for general communities at large, especially when it comes to health promotion behaviors. So if we're tracking things like overall physical well-being, physical health, and we find it's geographically clustered, that people in a certain area tend to have distinctively poor health in ways that we can document, there might be a public interest in figuring out why that's the case. But of course, we're also seeing this with COVID, thinking about how COVID-19 has changed what is and isn't in the public health. This is an interesting, or public interest, this is an interesting opportunity for us to reflect on how individual health behavior research, say, what does mask wearing look like in this community? What might increase compliance or incentivize mask wearing or vaccination? And who has the right to know if someone, say, has chosen not to wear masks or isn't vaccinated? And how do we think about how that information might integrate with larger public concerns? And then, of course, most importantly, for stakeholders, we have the data subjects or patients themselves. I go through this because the first step in doing ethics, the first step in thinking about how to be careful about the kind of work we do, is really going to be getting clear on who are the parties involved. And only once we have the parties listed can we start to think about what are the potential vulnerabilities, where are the times when the interests of parties might come into conflict, and most importantly, what are we going to do when that's the case? So let's talk about a few potential, I'm going to call them opportunities for solutions, which is the most euphemistic way of saying they're challenges. Things where stakeholders' interests may come into conflict. So some of these you've talked about before, earlier in this workshop. Some of these I think are not new to anyone, and some of these are things that maybe you haven't thought about yet, but are opportunities to think about. This, as always, is a non-comprehensive list. And that's because the potential for ethical conflicts is new and exciting and novel and never goes away. So thinking about how do I frame my research, my work, in terms of thinking about stakeholders and conflicting incentives or interests is one way to think about ethics at the design stage. So when we think about how to do ethics, frequently people think about how am I going to get an IRB approval approved? How am I going to think about how to do something that doesn't violate laws? To which I say, yes, yes, all important things. And that actually doesn't help us do the deeper work. Think about why am I doing the work that I'm doing? And how do I avoid perpetuating harm? How do I avoid doing things where I'm going to end up producing results that are not in accord with health promotion and the good of my population or my career? So let's talk about some potential areas of conflict, some areas of vulnerability. So I always like to start by talking about data access, because this is one of those areas where, when it comes to mobile health research, we had a really interesting canary in the coal mine. So one of the old school, like we tend to think about mobile health research in terms of just being a few decades old. One of the old school mobile health technologies has actually been around much longer than that. And that's sleep apnea treatment, thinking about using sensors and attached modems for people who have been diagnosed with various sleep disorders, primarily sleep apnea, to track their sleep at home. And so sensors monitor the breathing rates and also their compliance at wearing various kinds of sleep, I'm going to call them sleep aids, CPAPs, AutoPAPs, BiPAPs. Modems attached to those machines historically send that sensor data directly to their clinicians, who are then able to make changes to their prescription, their pressure prescription, and also track that they're using their device. Historically, we've used this sort of in the early days of mobile health technologies because these machines are extraordinarily expensive and insurance companies didn't want to pay for them if they weren't getting used, if they were sitting in people's closets. And compliance for these devices was really, really low. People in general don't adapt very quickly to sleeping with a mask on their face. And so what to do? The answer is use sensors to determine hours and compliance, send information directly to clinicians and also to insurance companies to guarantee compliance. So what happens next? Well, here's the next part of the process. An enormous amount of sleep data was being collected on people, still is for people who use these devices. And this data is hard to interpret, relatively opaque for individual end users. And so all of it went immediately to people who could analyze and interpret the data. The story did not end there. The software to analyze this data typically is proprietary for prescribers and licensed professionals. And an enormous number of individuals wanted to play with their own data, wanted to access what was going on with their own sleep. So remember that one of the values and potentials of mHealth in general is changing people's relation to their own data. Thinking about, instead of it being scientist, subject, now individuals can become both co-scientists and subjects themselves. Well, as part of that, people want access to their own data. And it turns out that if you are not able or willing to grant it to them, often people will go to pretty amazing and kind of delightful lengths to access it themselves. In this case, several years ago, a community of people with sleep apnea actually figured out how to hack their own machines. They wrote their own open source software to interpret the data themselves so that they didn't have to wait for the interpretation of their clinicians. The question of data access became urgent enough that people actually took proactive action. So when we think about our studies and think about how we're going to frame the enormous amount of data that we're gathering, part of the question is often we like to give packaged information back to our subjects because it's messy to look under the hood. And by that, I mean, it's hard to interpret what's exactly going on, and there's an enormous potential for problem. Thinking about what it looks like when people are not happy with that arrangement and take matters into their own hands is one of the areas we start to see conflict between stakeholders. There are a number of other potential conflicts. So earlier we talked about data ownership and the ability to pull data back. All right, well, so for many of us, if we truly de-identify data to the best of our capacity, it becomes close to impossible to genuinely pull it out. Thinking about what that means if someone owns their data and I'm no longer able to extract it, well, that means that they're not able to pull out after a certain point. Potential conflict. We also have questions about profits, especially as we're partnering potentially with corporations, thinking about technology that can be developed and marketed. There's a question of what rights subjects have to benefit from that. We also have questions of third parties. So if I'm capturing interesting data around what it is that you're doing using visual sensors, and I'm looking at your natural environment, collecting images of, say, what food is on your plate, I'm also collecting information on who you're with, who's around you, bystanders who may or may not, and in this case, probably not, went through any consent process to be part of my data and part of my research. And so there's an interesting paradox that the better my sensors are, the better the information I collect, the more information that I might collect from people who did not agree explicitly to be part of my data set. And so thinking about how to navigate the problem of third parties is one of our primary ethical challenges. We also have challenges around security of data and, of course, around privacy. It's one of my favorite quotes. Ethicists generally have morbid senses of humor. Part of what we do when we do all sorts of mobile health research is in collecting really, really valuable data on people's health, on things that are intimate and close to who they are and potentially stigmatizable. We live with the following knowledge, that the richer our data, the more useful, the more I can connect it to those natural environments, right? This was the ethical good, the potential of my research. The more vulnerable I make my subjects. So there's been an enormous amount of work thinking about how easy it is to re-identify subjects from what looks to be de-identified data. A number of people have gone through to demonstrate, give me 3 pieces of data that look to be de-identified from your study. It's probably enough for me to put back this data with someone's identity. The problem of true de-identification is something that all of us wrestle with, because the more data I strip, the more information I strip from whatever it is I'm studying, the less useful it becomes. Remember that part of our goal here is naturalistic environments, and yet our environments make us extremely identifiable. All potential conflicts. So what do we do, right? I promise I'm not going to leave you with, it's depressing, right? The end. The idea is, how do we navigate this in ways that allow us to promote the values that we're committed to, right? The values of the promotion of health and health behaviors, the well-beings of all of our stakeholders, but in particular our subjects, and the well-beings of our own careers and thinking about our own trajectories. What do I do with these conflicts? Well, let's talk about it. So the first thing that people tend to talk about when we talk about various kinds of ethical challenges is they think, let me just do a really, really solid informed consent document so that my subjects know what their risks and vulnerabilities are. And I love that idea conceptually. Part of the reason it's important to us is because one of the values that many of us grew up with, right? When you took your first research ethics class for your first grant funding or as part of grad school, you had, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, all these things like tattooed onto your body somewhere, either literally or metaphorically. And those are fabulous but vague commitments. And so when we think about autonomy, when I think about how do I value my patients' or subjects' well-being, it's not enough to say, well, I just do an informed consent. Here's why. So there's a few things that make focusing on informed consent as it currently exists problematic and not helpful. So the first is for any of you who have taught stats, which I do in ways that are sometimes humbling. One thing you'll notice is that people tend to be very, very poor estimators. People have a poor understanding of what different kinds of probability language actually mean. And so what that looks like is our informed consent documents frequently say something like, risk can include information being public, blah, 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 your personal health information being compromised, someone could access the database, limitations of our digital storage software, even though they're HIPAA compliant, up to and including death. They look a lot like the sort of informed consent sort of leaflets that happen on prescription medications, or the fabulous 3-point font warnings when we click through to install new software. Now, I'm just going to ask you, like, honesty in your own self, how often do you read the entire 3-point software consent forms to what data is being gathered on you? Now, given all of our fields, you probably represent the population that is most likely to read them, And the answer probably is that most of us don't. Go through, read every word, and then also analyze what are the likely potential risks and how likely are they to occur. And so what I have then is a system that's set up that's called the sort of throw everything at the wall risk approach of consent. Here's everything that could potentially happen, which incentivizes most of us sort of tuning out, scrolling through the entire list and clicking, or things that require really nuanced risk assessment for information that we actually can't give. How likely is it that your data will be compromised and information about you will become public? I can say it's not very likely because I have these protections in place, but that's not a very useful kind of statement. What does not very likely look like? And how is someone who isn't trained in risk assessment supposed to actually carefully evaluate that? So the larger challenge of consent is that what we have is an interesting and difficult seesaw. If we were in person, I would definitely do this, like act it out, but like we'll work with it on screen. So here's how it works. So with consent, the higher the actual consent of whatever it is that I'm looking at, the actual consent is you've consented to your data will be stored in this format, never sold to another individual or corporation, never be used for research beyond this exact narrow purpose that I'm asking you for. What I end up with is a list of really useful check, check, check. You've told me all of this explicit information. But what I get, what comes down lower on the lower end of the seesaw, is the more I lock in, the more I tell you explicitly here are the limitations that I will never, ever, ever use your data for anything else, the more usefulness gets limited. The more future potential for other kinds of discoveries, other kinds of information for the data set get locked out. Then the more, you can see the other side, the more I increase potential usability for future investigation into this data set, for future things that may be discoverable, the more open and unknown my actual consent process gets. And so as one side increases, the other side decreases. And thinking about the difficulties for consent and thinking about what that looks like means we have to think about things in a more nuanced way. So what do we do? Well, given the difficulties in genuine, robust respecting of autonomy with sort of this pro forma consent process, I suggest we move instead to thinking about consent through a model of trust, right? How well do these talks flow together? So what does it mean to have a structure of trust, to think about consent through a model of trust? It looks like thinking about what does it mean to be trustworthy? What are the interests of each stakeholder and how do I center those who are most at risk of harm? That will, of course, always be our subjects, our patients who we're looking at. But in particular, our subjects are vulnerable to harm in uneven ways. And being trustworthy means being very precise and careful about the unevenness of potential harm. So let's talk about a very non-complete list of how to build trust. What does it mean to be a trustworthy researcher? Well, here are some of the tools that we've got. So number one, part of being trustworthy is thinking about the lens of our choices through the question of bias. So we have here, of course, the illustration of infamous sync sensors, which render people with darker skin invisible. And here's a fabulous Twitter algorithm, which will always crop white faces, this is facial recognition, over dark faces, over people of color, people who are Black. What do we do with that? Now, no designer, I'm going to venture the guess here, was like, I know I have a deep commitment to racism. I want to build that into my algorithm because let me twirl my evil mustache. That's generally speaking not how this happens. How this happens is we tend to build on technology, research design, tools that have come before us. It's expensive to build from scratch. It's time consuming. And so we tend to import things that have come before. And part of the challenge of that is we end up building in the same historical biases that have existed continuously. How do I build trust? I look through my design with this lens. I think about, when is the potential for bias going to come in? Often it comes in at the question of, why am I framing my research as I am, and what assumptions underlie it? How do I think about why I've come up with the system I've come up with? And then at the level of technology, thinking about, how does my technology interact with the potential for bias on every level? So here are a few additional opportunities to think about trustworthiness. We're talking about historical places where medicine and science have marginalized and harmed. So thinking about, who am I researching and who am I leaving out? Remember that one of our fabulous potentials for mHealth research in general was the ability to broaden the subjects that I'm looking at, to get beyond our narrow, non-generalizable science. And who am I leaving out with not accessible or not careful, not intentionally ethically mindful design? Well, I'm leaving out people who have been historically harmed and marginalized in other ways. This accessibility is one of the main challenges when we think about the 1 billion people with disabilities living on the planet right now, and how many of them are incorporated into our mHealth research. Thinking about looking at what my research looks like when I treat my populations, not as special interest groups, but as just part of the body of people I'm trying to reach out to. And another way to be generally trustworthy is to think about preparing for contingencies, thinking about those conflicts. So here we have thinking about engineers and designers and government and data subjects. Part of this is to know and think about, where are my subjects vulnerable? So for me, thinking about status around documentation. Working with people without documentation means that I know, and something I have to be prepared for, is government potential intervention into trying to think about the kinds of work I do with my subjects. What are yours? How do you think about anticipating where the vulnerabilities are and making plans accordingly, so that these are the things you can communicate to your subjects? These are the things that help people make genuinely informed decisions, instead of laundry lists of, this could happen up to and including death. Here's the goal. The ultimate goal of all of this is for you to build an ethicist into the cloud, into the base of your research. Thinking about what the ethical potential conflicts are at the front end and incorporating them from design onward helps us avoid unforeseen consequences, or at least not be unprepared for them. And that's the end. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to unscreen share so I can see chat.
Tilda, thank you so much. You leave us with more questions.
Occupational hazard.
Occupational hazard. Wonderful. I'll leave it up to our scholars. There's a lot of wisdom here, but I think we're also habituated to PowerPoints where we are told what to do. Forgotten our humanity classes where we are taught how to think.
I start life as a professor, and part of that is interesting studies on pedagogy, right? And how people tend to retain information. And that's why I don't have a lot of words on my slides.
So to your question, how does one make a consent understandable? You went through some points. Give us some takeaways.
So part of what this looks like is think about what are the vulnerabilities of my subjects and how do I speak to those? So here are my vulnerabilities. My vulnerabilities might be if I'm doing research that could collect things that make my subjects legally vulnerable. Put that in the consent process. My policy for what I will or will not share data or collect data that may involve legal vulnerabilities for people. Is it possible that if I'm subpoenaed, what could be re-identified, given the reality that re-identification is frequently possible? That goes in consent. A list of sort of vague statements about it's possible your data could be compromised. Right, but what does that mean? What does it mean if data is compromised? And that's how to build a better consent. Thinking about what are the risks and interests of my subjects and how do I communicate those? That's the goal. I see a cheat sheet or template of trust building and vulnerability pitfalls. I don't currently have that, but that would be an excellent thing. And I'm happy to put that together. Ways to think about. This is part of larger work I do consulting with researchers before I started doing research work myself. Thinking about how do I build a communication system with my subjects that isn't pro forma, that isn't just please sign on the dotted line because, you know, I've now met my IRB requirements. How do I actually meet the ethical obligations and not just the legalistic ones?
And I'll open it up to the other scholars, but my question is exactly that, is we struggle with prescriptive language given by the IRBs who don't understand the nuances of mHealth research. And for those of us in the trenches, recognize the overload these patients are undergoing as they're confronting their health issues. So, and yet we give them this long list, which knowing very well they will never read it or understand it. Is there some suggestions you have how to approach our institutional IRBs?
Yes, this is as an ethicist, this is something that is frequently frustrating, I think, for many of us in this field, because IRBs don't always match up with what ethical obligations are, which is fine because their role is not always the same. But here's roughly how we recommend balancing that. What we view as a yes and approach to informed consent. So there will be something that the IRB likes, which is going to look like a pro forma list, usually, of like, here's everything that we can think of that could potentially happen, which again, no one is going to read. And there's a customized way to sort of increase communication with my subjects. So frequently for more vulnerable data, if you are collecting data that does put people, especially at risk of stigma, at legal risk, usually what we recommend is an iterative consent process where there's actual conversations with researchers so that the communication is not just written, it's not just a checkbox, but actually it's someone saying, so here's some potential areas that we've worried about. What do you worry about? How can I help answer your questions? Part of what that process looks like scaled up is thinking about who your subjects are and doing an awful lot of partnership with that community if you yourself are not part of that community, and thinking about collecting what are the risks and vulnerabilities that might be relevant as you tell me, as my partner in this research informs us, and how do I speak to those, right? Because the worst thing to do here is armchair and to think about, I know what you're gonna worry about, so here we go. When the goal here is always true partnership with the communities that we work with. So the yes and approach is whatever the IRB wants, and then the ethically responsible thinking about how to increase the quality of both communication and consent.
Terrific. I open it up to the scholars. Any questions? All right.
I'm going to use Streetwise as an example of how to do this well from this point forward. I'm listening to their processes and I'm like, I'm just going to give a slide with them and be like, do this thing. Fabulous work.